This is our premiere edition of Impact Matters, and we are now a monthly webcast with cutting-edge thinkers and change agents on the topic of impact. So I'm Amy Hall. I'm the founder of Impactorum, a coaching and advisory service for sustainability and CSR professionals, and I'm also the Vice President of Social Consciousness at Eileen Fisher, which is how I know Anela. You might have a few things to say, Anela.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Manella. I am an account executive for Eileen Fisher in Toronto, and I am a colleague of Amy's. I am also on today helping behind the scenes manage a bit of the logistics and the Q&A process. So a couple things I wanted to mention just before we start. At the bottom of your screen, you should see both a Q&A and a chat function. If you want to submit a question for Amy and Vincent, please do so through the Q&A. We're going to hold about 15 minutes at the end of the session, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can live as possible. Otherwise, feel free to use the chat throughout the session if you want to discuss or connect with any of the other attendees on the call. One important note about the chat though, your default settings right now are set to send your messages only to all panelists. So what you're going to need to do is just, before you send your message, make sure you change the setting to say all panelists and attendees. When you open your chat box, if you just look at the bottom, you will have that option, and that will make sure that everyone is able to see your message. And that is it for me, and I will see you guys later in the Q&A portion.
Thank you, Anela. So I'd like to take a minute to introduce Vincent. When I first met Vincent Stanley, we were both speaking at the University of New Hampshire Business School's Sustainability Day just a few years ago. And Patagonia and Eileen Fisher were beginning to become close allies in the field of sustainable apparel. And as I listened to Vincent share his personal story, how he got involved with Patagonia and how he contributes to their iconic worldview, I was really literally transfixed by his clarity, his calmness, and at the same time his urgent call to action for all of us to take notice of what really matters. So although he's held many different roles in the company, Vincent is currently Patagonia's Director of Philosophy. And if you've ever browsed a Patagonia catalog, then you've read his sublime writing. He is a poet first, and he's also the energy and wisdom behind much of Patagonia's positioning in the apparel industry and the world at large. I really want more people to know about how he considers the tension between building a successful business and restoring the earth for future generations. With that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Vincent Stanley.
Okay. Thank you, Amy.
Didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
I'm especially glad since we had so much trouble getting you on this, this call. I wanted just to start by asking you, generally speaking, given all that's going on, how are you doing and how is the company doing at this moment?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. My wife and I are doing fine for the most part. I mean, I think everybody goes a little bit stir crazy, but we're in Santa Barbara. It's not a bad place to be stuck. I was struck mostly at the beginning of the COVID crisis by how much the natural world came back. I mean, the skies are a color blue that I've never seen here in Southern California, where I've lived most of my life. It's almost like the trees were coming alive, and there's critters were coming closer to the house. So that was such an interesting lesson, and the fact that people have been able to connect using the technology. Everybody at Patagonia has been working at home. It's been hard on the business, and I think one of the things is we're starting to go through a process of seeing what we'll do post-COVID. We think more about slowing down a bit, not working quite as fast as we did before, of going back to more core styles, being involved even less in fashion, making things very high quality, making them so that they will be wearable for a very long time, and make sure that they're durable, to double down on our environmental efforts, particularly politically and socially. The issue around anti-Black racism has come to the fore during the COVID crisis and affects us. We're kind of a white company and a white business, and we're looking at how do we expand, because we really do believe that diversity actually strengthens a culture. So how do we expand our culture internally, and how do we expand this in terms of our presentation? And one of the interesting things, I think we may have talked about this, is that if you don't go to the office every day, it's almost like a return to the 18th century, where the blacksmith would have the workshop on the first floor and live on the second floor. The artificial distinction between private life and work life has been blurred during this crisis in a way I think that none of us really know how to absorb yet. The company will do okay. I mean, I think we were really worried at first about how quickly the business would come back. Of course, we're still worried because the crisis is growing again. But our customers are coming back to us. When we were shut down totally for 2 months, and now with e-com business, customers are coming back. We're still engaging people through the stores with curbside pickup and also some environmental events. So we'll see.
I think, at Eileen Fisher, we can relate to this, to everything you've said as well. However,
Yeah.
you have an additional complication, which is that Rose has now moved on. And I'm just curious if you're able to speak about it, how that's affecting either internal morale or the business direction or anything of that sort.
Yeah. I think it's actually, it's interesting. Rose had put into effect a process about a month ago, 6 weeks ago, about asking everyone in the company to really look at the next steps. How do we recover? How do we stabilize? And how do we reimagine the business in the future? And she launched that. She was planning to leave at the end of the year. And I don't know what happened, but something happened that she decided to take off now. But a couple of things I'd want to say. One is she's the best CEO we've ever had. I think everybody would agree with that. She did amazing work to both stabilize the business and help us really be a good business in terms of on-time delivery and improving our relations with suppliers. And also on the activist front, she was absolutely terrific and she was fearless. So she's great and she's moved on. But I think that she put this reimagined process into play means that we're doing this work at exactly the right time. Before we bring on another leader, we will actually go through this process of saying, okay, how do we want the business to work for the next few years? We had strong goals before, and they're still the same goals. We want to get out of fossil fuels as a source for polyester and nylon. We want to strongly advance regenerative organic agriculture for cultivating hemp and cotton. But work culture changes, and also I think we realize that we all have to be more nimble at this point, that what we've predicted tentatively for many years, that the twin social and environmental crisis that the Pope referred to is here. It manifests itself in some new way every few months. I mean, the year started off with the historic fires in Australia, moved into COVID, moved into social unrest over police brutality. I don't think there's going to be another normal. I think that we're going to be facing all of the chickens that have come home to roost in the 21st century, and we'll all be having to do our best to address these in as holistic and systemic a way as possible for the benefit of the environment and for human beings to create more equity.
I wanted to just comment a little on your this piece you had written at the beginning, closer to the beginning of the pandemic than
Yeah.
to where we are now. It almost feels dated, actually, as I think about
Yes.
it, given
Yeah.
all that's happened. But you had written this beautiful piece called Blue Skies and the COVID Spring, and you had posted it
Yeah.
on medium.com for anybody who wants
Yeah.
to go look it up. And you had commented on how we can't make our living as businesses and business people at
Yeah.
the expense of Mother Earth. And I feel like there's a bigger message now that you might want to reflect on. First of all, I was wondering if you're writing anything new, but also how do you reconcile that tension between doing business responsibly with planetary and social well-being?
Well, one of the things that I wrote in the piece, which is outdated because it was before the Black Lives Matter and it didn't deal with social issues. But what I noticed in the piece was that, especially early on, when there was so much uncertainty over what was going to happen and people hadn't adjusted to this at all, was the economic pain in contrast to the environmental benefits of the slowdown. And that, I think, is just something to hold close to mind and heart as we go forward. That I was just reading today that scientists all over the world are studying the air because it's still better than some businesses come back to life, but it's still better than it was before. So how do we we have to change. It's no longer sustainable to in even the most simple way to pursue business as usual at the expense of social equity and at the expense of planetary health. You just can't do it anymore. So how do we start to bring our businesses into line with social and planetary needs?
The author Naomi Klein has described
Mm-hmm.
Patagonia as a experiment, a unique experiment, and
Mm-hmm.
kind of thinking about how you just described what we must do as citizens of the planet and as business people feels like what you're describing should become the new normal, even though you just said there won't be a new normal. But
Yeah.
do you think it's really possible to exist in that way, to run a business, to be fully responsible for our impacts
Yeah.
on the planet, etc.?
Yeah. And I think it is. I think it will take a long time. I don't think it's going to be easy or without pain. But I think that there are a couple of perspectives that might help us. I wouldn't say steps, but perspectives. And one is to revitalize the local perspective. What is the health of the community? What is the health of the communities that we operate in? I think that becomes more important as places are challenged locally and as we begin to live more locally with it, less flying around, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing is the opposite of that, which is connectivity. Is we're all getting together by Zoom and by Microsoft Teams. So when all of it's interesting in Florida, for instance, where everybody has to deal with, all the governments have to deal with sea level rise. Now, the state of Florida has banned the term climate change from any kind of official usage. So you've got 3 counties that are Republican and 3 counties that are Democrat working on mitigation for sea level rise. They can't use the term climate change, but they all have to work together. And there are other places in the world, like the Netherlands, where they've been dealing with sea level rise for 200 years. And then there are places in the world that could benefit from both the experience of Amsterdam and the experience of Miami, say in Dhaka in Bangladesh, where they're going to be dealing with sea level rise. So the potential, on the one hand, of actually living where we live, and on the other hand, of connecting with other people on the problems that we mutually face. I think that those 2 perspectives are going to be the ones that we're going to need the most in order to reduce the harm we do, and also to increase practices that actually regenerate human communities and that regenerate natural life on the planet.
And being I have a tendency to be cynical, even at the same time as I am optimistic. I have both of those values run rampant in me, and I just wonder how you think about business as a whole, the whole business community out there in the world, and do you think that there's enough heart and soul in that business community to allow that to happen, or rather than just let the almighty dollar kind of rule our decisions?
Well, here's where this is a little bit, it's not that I think that people's hearts will change, though I think they will. I mean, I don't think there aren't a lot of hard-hearted people in business, but they leave a lot of that stuff at home when they go to work. It's not welcome, those personal values. But there are real, I mean, I would hate to be working at a cola company today and working on my 10-year business plan for selling sugared water in plastic bottles to more and more people around the planet, and dependent on that for the profits, for how I feed my family and my employees. So I don't think that the conditions themselves that we're facing will allow businesses as we have come to know it to thrive. And that will help bring it. Necessity will be the mother of invention here. But also, I think there has been enough talk. It's not in a lot of places. There are only, I mean, when I look at large multinational publicly traded companies, I look at, well, yeah, Unilever's done some stuff, and Danone, Danone North America is the largest B Corp in the world. And I remember when they made that a benefit corporation, the CEO of the whole shooting match, based in Paris, Emmanuel Faber, said that he was initially moved to become a benefit corporation and to make the whole company a benefit corporation by Patagonia's "Don't Buy This Jacket" ad, which appeared in 2011. And for those who don't know it, the "Don't Buy This Jacket" ad essentially highlighted one of our products and said that, this is a really good product environmentally. Or last 10 years, it's cradle to cradle. We recycle it into a new polymer of equal value, et cetera, et cetera. But still, it takes more from the planet than it can give back. It still generates so much greenhouse gas. It generates so much waste. It uses so much water. So, but he looked at that ad, and what we were advising customers to do is change the way you think about what you buy, change the way you think about how you consume, because everything has a consequence, and that manufacturers have to adopt the same responsibility toward what we make. And he said he saw that ad and said it taught him that you could appeal to customers on the basis of values as well as instincts. And I think that since 2011, when that ad appeared, the last 9 years, there's more of a kind of general recognition that in the world of commerce, that in the world of consumption, in the world of economics, you can't put aside the most basic human values of dignity and fairness and equity and compassion and expect to thrive in any way. Because what you ignore will bite you. There's my cynic coming out.
I'm glad you have some of that. I wasn't sure. I have so many directions I could take that. I guess what I'd like to think about is, so when I think about my experience at Eileen Fisher, our customers don't necessarily come and buy our clothes because of the messaging
Mhm.
around and our practices around environmental
Mhm.
sustainability and social well-being, et
Yeah.
cetera. I often think about it, that messaging as being the icing on the cake. It's the thing that will bring them
Mhm.
back. It's the thing
Yeah.
that keeps them as long-term customers. So how does that translate to your world at Patagonia?
I
Yeah.
think about the same. I don't think anybody buys a raincoat to save the world. They buy a raincoat to keep them dry in a rainstorm. But if they have a choice of raincoats, they might want to buy the raincoat from the company whose values they feel they align with. Also, I think it's a long journey. It's hard for business people who want to see results very quickly. But I would say only in the last 12 years have customers really come to us on the basis of values rather than a reputation for quality, which was very strong for a long time. And Eileen Fisher has been on this road uh, for for a long time, but a little less long than we have. And I think I think it takes time for that to bake in the customer's mind. And then when it does, it's really long lasting and deepens the relationship and really works. It works as a business model because you, rather than going after transactions, you have relationships with a number of people that can be renewed. Um, but it's not as though it's a marketing ploy to be socially and environmentally responsible. That doesn't really appeal to people as a kind of, oh, I want to buy it because of that. It's more like, oh, I trust them. They've been consistent for a long time, and I feel comfortable buying from them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or I want to encourage. I want to be a part of that community. I want to be a part of Eileen Fisher, or I want to be a part of Patagonia.
So what do you think going forward, coming out as we try to kind of recenter ourselves coming out of the
Mm-hmm.
pandemic and the racial justice movement, et
Mm-hmm.
cetera? Do you feel like the consumer attitudes are going to shift at all? Have you seen any evidence of that, or what's your best
Yeah.
guess?
Yeah, my best guess is that based a little bit on history, but also that history is being reinforced now. I remember during the recession of 2008-9, we did really well. And that's when people loosened up their purse strings. They tended to say, okay, I'm going to buy from people I trust or people I like first. And so we did well in financial terms. And what we noticed is when we opened up e-com that people responded. When we've opened up the stores in Europe, that um, people have, they, if they have something they want to buy, they've been coming to us. So um, the crisis is not over. It's having a resurgence, particularly here in the West, and as well as in the South. So we don't know how quickly the business can recover, but I don't think it's not as though we weren't open for 2 months and everybody forgot about us. Everybody remembered. So
Mm-hmm. And one more question relating to you in Patagonia. I apologize. And I want to
yeah,
shift to this idea of impact. Well, two questions. So one is when you think about the intersection of the climate crisis and racial justice, is
Mm,
Patagonia taking any kind of new stance on that or thinking about that at all?
we are. Um, I mean, we approach the question in three ways. One is our own culture and our own hiring practices, and it's not just a matter of expanding hiring. You have to really create a company where people can see themselves, and you want to make sure that a lot of different kinds of people can see themselves in the Patagonia context. The second is how we uh, represent people in the photographs of the sports and in the that we're engaged in. And then the third is on the environmental front. And we have supported for a number of years environmental justice groups. Um, we've made a film whose title I've forgotten, but we focused on a neighborhood in Los Angeles threatened by pollution from a plant. We know that, for instance, in Black and brown communities, that people support environmental action more strongly than do white people, because people of color are the first to suffer, as they are suffering in the COVID crisis far more than affluent populations. So, and we have a lot of, I think about 15% of our environmental giving goes to environmental justice groups, and I think we'll look at expanding that. And also, we have a platform called Patagonia Works, in which we link customers by region to environmental groups by type, and so we want to expand the work there. And this is so new. I mean, I think there's always when an issue comes to the fore and becomes a national crisis, there's a tendency to respond very quickly. But what I'm more concerned about is the long-term work that needs to be done, and it is long-term work. When the attention is focused on something else, when attention goes away from it.
Yeah, I agree. When back in the early days when I was starting out in this path of work, somebody who was senior in the company at that time said to me to expect real change to take 3 generations, real culture change to take 3 generations. And I think about that in the context of where we are today. And when I think about the internal and the workplace shifts that have to change, and how we individually think about our relationship, particularly to racial justice movement, and how we have individually contributed to it, promoted it inadvertently perhaps, et cetera, and what it's going to take to kind of not just intellectually change our way of looking at this, but also just, completely shift. It's going to be a very long process. So I appreciate that.
So it's huge.
Who are do you have any, who are the people that you look up to right now? People or companies?
Well, it's funny because when people ask about, are there other companies like Patagonia, and lately I've been saying, oh yeah, Eileen Fisher. I mean, in the apparel business, because you guys are, and I say that because you guys are looking at everything you do. And there are a lot of companies that I would look at and say, ooh, you know, Nike, they're really good at resource efficiency, which will reduce environmental impact. That's a strong thing. There are, Dr. Bronner's has a higher B Corp rating than Patagonia does. They're at 175 and we're at 151.5, I think.
I am shocked.
They do amazing work. They're not as a large company, but they do amazing work in their supply chain. In terms of really paying attention to every ingredient that goes into their products. I'm a big fan of what Paul Pullman did at Unilever and of what his successor is doing, that they're making more of their subsidiaries B Corps than have Danone. That's kind of in the business world. There are others I might think that I'm not thinking of, that if you asked me about, I would say, oh yeah, they do that. And then you see more and more people kind of slowly stepping up to the plate, doing more things. And we've seen some companies kind of drop off that used to be more engaged in the business, more engaged on this side of the business.
Well, so speaking of companies then, there are lots of companies out there that do talk about having impact, measuring their impact, having less impact, all of that kind of stuff. I just wonder how you think about impact, and what does real impact look like? I guess, you know, particularly from the Patagonia perspective, but even if you're looking at other companies, what really is meaningful when you think about impact these days?
You know, it's interesting because it's not, impact is not a word we've used as a kind of to describe our activities. And what but I'll tell you what we have used for a long time, and that is that we use the term, and we didn't use the word sustainability. We were very suspicious of it because we said, okay, everything we're doing basically is extractive. And you don't want to pretend as though your actions are sustainable when in fact they're all you've done is reduce the harm. So there are two ways I think you can have a positive impact or you can have a negative impact. And in terms of positive impact, we look at these. We got into the food business in a small way. But the interesting thing about the food business is we're not in there to become General Mills or even Arrowhead or King Arthur Flour. We're in the business specifically. What we find is that when we identify a particular problem in agriculture, and we can come up with a product that helps solve it, that for us provides a really interesting way, a really interesting direction for business, because it's not a question of reducing harm, it really becomes a question of positive good. So to give you an example, there's this great guy, Wes Jackson, who's now 80 something, from Salina, Kansas. He's an agronomist. 25 years ago, he developed a perennial wheatgrass hybrid that extends its roots 17 feet deep into the ground, right? Which kicks up all the microbes and the fungi and creates soil at this amazing rate. So he's telling us about this. And his lifelong ambition is to restore the Great Plains to health. We love him. We're talking to him. And he's describing this wheatgrass called Kernza. And we said, okay, that's wonderful. Where can we buy some? He said, oh, you can't buy that. He said, no one will grow it. We said, well, why won't they grow it? Well, they can't sell it to anyone. There's no market for it. So what we did is we partnered with a brewery in Portland, Oregon, and we created a beer out of it. And we got Whole Foods to carry it in 108 West Coast stores. And we got the first 200 acres of Kernza planted in Minnesota. And now other people are using Kernza, and that's expanded. So that's an example of the kind of business you just go into it specifically to solve social and environmental problems and start to create. That's the kind of impact we're looking for. Because when you're bringing soil back to health, you're actually giving back to nature more than you're taking. And
you just answered the question I was going to ask you, which is what is the problem that solution solved? Okay.
Yeah. And just related to our previous conversation, one of the things we've created with Dr. Bronner's and with Rodale, a new certification process, regenerative organic agriculture. And one of the things we discovered is that if you want to bring soil back to health, you cannot ignore the role of animals. So you have to have 21st century animal welfare standards. And you cannot ignore the health of workers and worker communities, including economic health. So there again, the link of social and environmental is often hidden, but not very deeply. It's really intertwined. So
the question that I've heard others voice around regenerative organic ag is, how do you bring that to scale? Because it's already really expensive for farmers and time consuming for farmers to become organic. And there hasn't been, well, I'm talking about perhaps specifically in the fiber category, not necessarily food, but there hasn't been a great business case set before them. And so then to layer on regenerative, how do you see this translating into a real growth opportunity for farmers?
There are obstacles, and I think a couple of there are two primary obstacles. One is not so much in fiber, but in food, is distribution, because the farmer doesn't get any money. And then related to that is the issue of finances. If somebody's going to even go organic, it takes 3 years, and to go regenerative probably takes 5 to 7 years. There's a wonderful little documentary called, it's about a farm. I can't remember the title. It's about a farm very close in Moore Park that, in which this idealistic couple from Santa Monica goes and buys some land and decides to go organic. And it takes them 7 years to produce this organic farm. But at the end of that time, it's amazingly productive.
Is it called The
And
Biggest Little Farm?
yeah, you
Something like
got it.
that?
The biggest
Okay.
little farm, exactly. So that's the kind of transition we face. We'll need financing and we'll need support. In fiber, I think the biggest experiments we're running now are in India, where it's a little less daunting. I mean, most farmers are not making money off their farms; they're making money off their jobs, and they're supporting their farms from, organic farms. They're supporting their farms from one of the partners has a job. So we really have to address the whole issue of finances. That is the biggest. That's where the business case needs to be made, because until we can create a livelihood, it's going to be very difficult to develop organic farming. And to a lot of extent, what we want to do is to create something which replicates but doesn't scale. I mean, what you're starting to see now is, most organic carrots come from Mexico, which is fine, except that the nutritional value is, it's kind of organic light. It's the absolute minimum to meet the organic standard. No chemicals, but really not a lot put in to make a carrot a real carrot. It's not like the carrot you're going to get from your own garden. So I would hope for the development of more agriculture along the kind we see when we see our farmers at farmers markets.
So why don't we pause here, and Anela, if there are any questions, maybe we can take them from the audience. I could keep going, but I'd love to make sure others have an opportunity.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. So I have one here, and the question is for Vincent: if you had one chance to propose a radical new idea or commitment with major environmental or social impact to your board of directors, what would you propose?
Oh, a nice easy one to start with.
Yeah. I'm going to duck that one. I'll tell you, in a way, it's kind of easy to answer. There's something called the 80-20 rule. So it works for everything. So if I look at our business and what creates the most environmental impact is fabrics. I think it's 86% of our environmental impact is in our textiles. But you can't just go after that. You really have to pay attention to every aspect of your business and every stakeholder you have. Focusing, yes, we do have to, we are focused on that, but it doesn't give you a kind of KPI or magic bullet that enables you to ignore everything else you're doing. So the one thing that I would recommend to the board is easy. It's that. The board knows it. So it's not going to be news to them. But a lot of people talk about, you run your business you pick your three most important things, you pursue that, and everything else is a distraction. I think business is more like running a household. You've got to get the food on the table, you've got to get the garden planted, you've got to keep the furniture clean. It never stops, and you have to pay attention to everything if you want the household to work. And by the way, economy and household come from the same Greek root, oikos. And then basically what we're looking at in an economy is a group of households.
Wow. Okay. Great, thank you. And Anela, do you want to throw another question in?
Yeah, a little bit related here. So what are the key skills and traits you see as important in leadership to make the kind of changes companies need to make to address climate change, systemic racism, and the other big challenges in our society?
I think it's a dance. The best thing that leadership can do is to be bold. When you have a set of things that you want to do or a set of values that you want to go by, to protect the organization in its effort to pursue those values. And Rose was really great at that. But the other thing that becomes really important is if you really want to make social and environmental changes, is you have to engage everybody in the action. And so I think that there's a principle called subsidiarity, which means you push decision making as low as possible, and you ensure that everybody affected by a decision has some kind of voice in it. And on the one hand, you don't want that to come at the expense of accountability, but I think a combination of steadfastness from a leader and really engaging the whole organization in creating the future. Those are the qualities that I think are most important. We've been really lucky at Patagonia, just briefly, to have committed owners, to have a CEO like Rose, but also to have a really deep culture, especially in middle management, that is committed and able to communicate what's going on and what needs to be done.
Yeah, I was just curious, how does that actually happen? It's one thing to believe in that and to say that you have that kind of culture, but to actually make it happen and work is a completely different animal. It's really hard to achieve.
It is. That's where getting out of the way helps. I'll give you an example. So right after Trump was elected, it was Black Friday was coming up, and we were going to close all the stores and paint the windows black and put up little posters and say, go volunteer for a local environmental organization. So everything is in place. My wife and I were in Washington the Friday before that Black Friday, and she was working with the social media people. And then Monday morning, I get these stirrings that over the phone that something is going on, something is happening. And it turns out that some low-level employee in e-com who hadn't been with the company very long came in on Monday morning and said, we're doing the wrong thing. What we should do is keep the stores open. Instead of giving 1% for the planet, give 100% for the planet. And that'll be a much more effective. So went to his boss at 9 o'clock. Boss went up. By 11 o'clock, the CFO had kind of gone 0.7%. And then it went to Rose and it went to the family. And that was Monday afternoon. And we turned on a dime and we did it on Friday. Ordinarily, we would do $2 million. That's what we were planning. We did 10 million worldwide. 35% of the customers were new. Anybody who works in marketing knows how expensive and difficult it is to get new customers. And it was all at full price, including there were some customers who came back on Monday and said, I went crazy. Can I bring some stuff back? And we said, sure. Yeah. So that's the kind of thing, kind of standing out of the way of not getting, of being responsive to good ideas that come up and executing as quickly. And people love to do that. I mean, everybody got so engaged with this. They made it happen. Yeah. It's a banshee on the
Some very noisy neighbors walking by on our street. You know, it occurs to me that's just another example. You had given one earlier about how you're influencing other businesses, because other businesses have since followed suit and have done similar things on Black Friday. And I just think, you know, again, you all set the standard. You keep raising the bar for the rest of us. We're just trying to keep up.
But it's easier to raise that bar if you've got everybody behind it, rather than if you're in the marketing department thinking, oh, what are we going to do to outdo ourselves? You know?
Yeah, that's right.
Let the life from the company help create the life that you're going to have in the future.
It's amazing. Anela, do we have others?
Yeah, we do. I have one. Do you think a conventional company can become really sustainable, or does sustainability need to be right at the founding of a company?
You know, Patagonia didn't have that luxury, neither did Eileen Fisher. I mean, when we started business, that wasn't on our radar. We didn't have any idea of how to become responsible, or that we could become responsible. We just figured you buy the metal from, you buy the iron from the steel company, and you buy the cotton from the broker, and those are your choices. So I think it is easier. I don't know if it's easier, but I think it is better for a company to start out right, to have those values right in place, to give 1% for the planet from the beginning. You don't notice it if your business is $100,000 and you're giving 1,000. Then when you become $5 million, it doesn't matter that you're giving that much. But if all of a sudden you build a $10 million company and you just said, okay, now we're going to be good guys, that's a lot harder than if you say, okay, these values are going to inform our decisions from the beginning.
And I agree with you 100%. And I also think that the big challenge for new businesses starting out now is they really do want to try to do everything, but that's also impossible. And they will have to prioritize. Yeah. They just won't have the financial wherewithal. Yeah. I remember, because we used to fund socially conscious women-owned businesses, and I remember some of them calling, one person in particular calling and saying, you know, we really wanted to have 100% US made product. And now we find we have to, in order to keep our costs down, we're being advised to source a particular component in Taiwan. What should we do? And I said, you know what, maybe you know, look at that supplier in Taiwan. Maybe they're a really great supplier, but you know, you might have to make these kind of compromises, not sacrifice. And really be clear on which values are most important to you at the given time. And, you know, you can work up the ladder over time.
Yeah. And that does become, I mean, because people trust you for coming through on what you say. I worked with a company that actually made this shirt. It's organic cotton dress shirts, and they really wanted to do US manufacturing. And it was so hard. Paying what Patagonia would pay sample prices for. So you have to be a little careful about, and you have to be willing to say, okay, we really wanted to do this, but we couldn't. And I think that transparency actually helps you with your customer and with your other stakeholders. When you say, listen, this is what we ran into. The interesting thing about, say, 1% for the planet is great. Like, people have come to us and say, oh, you know, your business was down 35% for the spring. Are you still giving to environmental causes? And yeah, we're giving 1%, you know. Good years or bad, that's a commitment that we can honor, that we don't have to vary from. So. And
you were there at the beginning. I think Patagonia was the founder or a co-founder of 1% for the planet, right?
Yeah, we were co-founders, but we'd already been doing that as a company for 13 years. So it was the idea was to propagate that among other.
Which again, you have very effectively. So I know we need to wrap up. Do you have any final words? And I'm thinking maybe any advice for those on the call, one action that people can do or something they can think about now?
Yeah, you know, that's a good question. And I think it is, it's interesting. I was talking to a friend who builds low-cost green housing. He's probably the guy who does this most of the United States. And it's an interesting comment. It's a great business model to always tie together your what makes you succeed as a business with what you care about most. Because if they're separate, and it's always a compromise, that's tough. But anyway, so he's the biggest developer of green, low-cost housing and works mostly in disadvantaged neighborhoods. And he was talking about the time we're facing, and he was using the word tenderness, which I thought was really interesting, because tenderness works both ways. One is how we are together that keeps us alive and keeps us fulfilled. And tenderness is also raw. It's also, you know, it's not, it's vulnerable to being hurt if you're tender. So I think it's a tender time, and I think it's something to keep in mind. You know, work life is less separated from personal life, as we're all working from home for probably some time to come. So I think that's a word to hold in mind.
Tender. There's also a business meaning for tender, but we won't go there right now. Thank you. Thank you,
Okay,
Vincent.
thank you, Amy. It's always wonderful to talk to you in
And with an
person or in
audience.
Zoom or with an audience or privately. So thank you
Well,
for the work. Thanks for the work you do.
I'm right back at you. I'm just so honored that you you agreed to do this and to be my very first guest and my very first conversationalist, and to everybody for being patient with us at the beginning and sticking with us for this hour, and to Anella for oh my gosh, holding this together, because I think this wouldn't have happened without you, Anella. And I do a little quick ad. Our next one will be on July 23rd with impact investor, author, and entrepreneur Morgan Simon. So I hope people join me for that. And thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.